Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to the Lowy Institute for this Wednesday lunch. Very glad to see a full house here today. I'm Rory Medcalf. I direct the International Security Program here. Our speaker today is covering one of those subjects which could be defined as international security or national security or domestic security, but the strong international dimensions to terrorism are such that we feel it's a very appropriate subject for an event at the Lowy Institute. As many of you would know, the Australian government is developing a national security strategy and, of course, a defence white paper at the moment, and these will, among many other things, offer conclusions about the place or the nature of the threat that we often reduce to the simple word terrorism. Now, you don't have to see terrorism as an existential threat or a strategic threat to, if you like, the integrity or the survival of certain states and countries, our own included, to acknowledge that at the very least it is an immediate and persistent threat to human lives, to social order, and to, I think it's fair to say, humane values in many parts of the world, and in particular a threat to the very international fabric of trust and interdependence that is so crucial to the functioning of today's world order, and which, perversely enough, has actually made today's forms of terrorism so potentially dangerous. Now, while many of us can agree that there's been too much emphasis, perhaps in recent years, on the role of military force in countering terrorism, it's much harder to agree on what the alternatives might be. But one view I think that can't be contested, and that our speaker here today I think will underline, is that understanding the reasons for terrorism, the motivations of terrorism, is very much a part of the answer. And this isn't simply about identifying the political issues, the causes, the grievances that create fertile ground for terrorist tactics. It's also about the intersection of political science and, among other things, psychology. For even in the most grievance-rich soil, not everyone becomes a terrorist. So our speaker today will be really talking about what drives people to join terrorist organisations. Is there a typical profile of a terrorist? And what are the implications of this, if you like, of these findings for governments? These are some of the vital national security questions I think that all governments have been grappling with in recent years, and we've had a horde of experts leap into the breach. But many of them have been general security scholars who, for various reasons, have refashioned themselves as terrorism experts with varying degrees of success. Adam Dolnik is not one of them, I'm glad to say. He's the real thing, someone who studied terrorism, made his vocation the study of terrorism quite some time before it became fashionable. And when you see his youthful appearance, you'll wonder how long ago that was, but it was some years before 9/11. Adam Dolnik is, in my view, a very valuable addition to the small pool of terrorist experts we have in Australia. He's currently the Director of Research Programs and the Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Transnational Crime Prevention at the University of Wollongong. So it's also good to see, if you like, the diffusion of terrorism expertise beyond some of the more traditional centres of security studies in Australia. He has formerly served as the Chief Trainer at the International Centre for Political Violence and Terrorism Research in Singapore and at the UN Terrorism Prevention Branch in Vienna, and I understand that in those days it was a very small branch indeed. He's advised many governments and many agencies in many countries, including Australian federal and state agencies, particularly on the very life and death issue of hostage negotiation, which is something that I think will come into some of his comments today, and he's published an authoritative book on this subject. So I'm very pleased that Adam's in Australia. He's fresh from, I think, giving advice at a course in Malaysia, literally right off the plane, so please be merciful in your question and answer session. His work draws on field research in many countries, including Afghanistan, Colombia, and I believe in Russia as well, where he's worked on understanding what led up to the Beslan and Moscow theatre incidents, or the massacre at Beslan and the tragedy at the Moscow theatre some years ago. So a lot of practical research behind what he has to say. It's my great pleasure to ask Dr Adam Dolnik to come up and speak, and we'll have question and answer afterwards. Thanks. Thanks.
Good Afternoon. Thank you very much, Rory, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the Lowy Institute for the invitation to come here and speak to you today. Just as a small disclaimer, typically this presentation would take 2 to 3 hours. It'd be very interactive. Unfortunately, given the 30-minute time limit, we cannot do that, but hopefully whatever's missing will come out in the question and answer session. What makes a terrorist? It's a hot subject, and everybody has an opinion on it. Where do our opinions come from? We are raised in a certain way. We have certain beliefs that are instilled into us through our culture, religion, upbringing, through examples of our parents, and so forth. From a certain point on, we're quite firm in terms of what we believe, what our belief system is, or our basic views about the world. And from that point on, we have a tendency to view the world through a certain lens. When we read the newspaper every day, we take on board all the good points that confirm our viewpoint, and we casually ignore all those little points that seem to contradict everything that we believe. And through this process, our opinions are shaped, and especially if we are not professionals in a particular social science discipline, we don't give it much thought in terms of what our thought process is and where do our conclusions come from. If we were to ask every single person here today about what motivates terrorists, everybody would have an opinion, and it would range on a scale between two specific, quite extreme points. One point would be the view of terrorism as a product of a strategic choice. Basically, terrorists are people who are not born into being terrorists, they are made by circumstances. And they view terrorism as a strategy toward achieving certain political or other social or religious objectives. At the other end of the spectrum, you would have people who argue that terrorism is a product of psychological forces, specifically when we look at people like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who beheaded the American contractor Nicholas Berg with a dull knife to make it hurt more in a very brutal fashion. We have a hard time imagining that somebody who is not mentally ill could actually do something like that. So between these two extremes, we have all sorts of different opinions. What we'll try to do in this lecture is to instill some sort of a systematic examination in terms of what evidence exists to support each viewpoint. Part of social science, too, is not just to look at what supports each allegation, but also to look at the evidence that runs contrary to every observation. This is really the way that helps us narrow down the scope of certain conclusions. The terrorism studies field has existed for almost 50 years now. Let's look at some of the common misconceptions and common holes that exist in this academic field of study. Many terrorism experts, when we hear them speak on television, they don't necessarily represent the scientific point of view. Every single one of these people has their own biases, their own life experiences, their own ideology, which they project into their conclusions. Some of the difficulties in terrorism research include lack of a common definition. Essentially, every researcher who conducts research into this area defines terrorism differently, which makes it very difficult to build on other people's conclusions, because somebody may include FARC's guerrilla activities into their examination, while somebody else who's using a more narrow definition of terrorism, focusing simply on activities that attack civilians, will have a hard time using that broader pool. Most of terrorism research that we've seen is quite descriptive in its approach and very anecdotal. We'll make a point, and then we'll use a couple of examples to support the point that we are making. Unfortunately, if you know your history of terrorism well enough, you can use such anecdotal evidence to support just about any perspective. Okay? So that's not a particularly systematic approach. Also, this line of research is very much event-driven. It's highly policy-oriented, so people tend to focus on the latest fashion. And there's a relative lack of long-term studies examining the processes of a particular terrorist group over, say, a decade. We focus on something that's on the news yesterday and that's likely to be on the news next year. Many terrorism scholars use the firefighter approach. In other words, many terrorism scholars who are academics see themselves as in the front lines of fighting terrorism. And I don't think that's necessarily very good. If we use this firefighter analogy, an academic researcher on terrorism should be looking at the principles of combustion, more so than pulling out a hose. Unfortunately, many terrorism experts do get too much involved in the policy line. Sometimes this leads to quite simplistic, comforting answers. Essentially, if you want to be successful when you work with agencies, tell them what they want to hear. Another problem that we have dealing with terrorism is that sometimes we search for the silver bullet. We look for that one thing that will make it go away. And this is an approach that cannot possibly work. There are going to be many different incremental steps with varying degrees of effectiveness, but there's hardly going to be that one thing that is going to resolve the problem. Of course, in terrorism research, until recently, we have had a heavy Western bias in the sense that most researchers in this field came from America, Britain, Germany, France, some from Australia, very much Western countries, which leads to perhaps a limited understanding of things like culture, religion, and specifics of particular regions. But fortunately, we have seen an influx of scholars from other cultures as well, which has been quite beneficial to this field. There's a one-sided bias in terrorism research. To conduct research, you need money. Where do you get money for terrorism research? From governments, right? It's something like conducting research on lung cancer when it's sponsored by Philip Morris. Okay? It doesn't necessarily completely alter everything that you say. You won't necessarily change the principles of scientific research. But just because you have better access to information from governments than you do from terrorist groups will affect your analysis. Specifically, if you look at effectiveness of counterterrorism measures. Many researchers tend to emphasize government actions as being the determinants of an end of a terrorist campaign. But we don't really know what is happening on the inside with terrorist organizations. And this results in our inability to account for everything that is happening on the inside and the ability of groups to put themselves out of business independently of government actions. This is really an angle that we don't know much about. Also, in the terrorism research field, there's an enclosed circular research system. Basically, what's happened is that there were quite a few scholars, or I should say relatively few scholars, focusing on this area before 9/11, which meant that the demarcation lines were quite broad. So somebody would go study the LTT in Sri Lanka, they would write an article. Everybody cites that article, and nobody goes back to check the facts. And this has led to the proliferation of miscitations, creation of cases that never happened, citations of interviews that never happened, poor translations which resulted in completely wrong conclusions. When I used to work at the Manner Institute of International Studies in California, where we had a database on all chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear terrorism, we found out on deeper investigation that 40% of all cases that we collected never happened, okay? And were a product of combination of two different events, mixing, matching, and so forth. So that's important to realize. Statistics, that's another category altogether. It's very difficult to do statistical analysis of terrorism because of different definitions used by different databases. Even different government agencies use different statistics. State Department in the US has different definition than the Defense Department, and their statistics will be very different on the trends of terrorism. Even if you are an objective researcher who tries to get to the root of the problem and you go into the field to interview terrorists, it's a difficult issue, especially today when you have people like Zarqawi. It's not talking to the Provisional Irish Republican Army anymore, who were happy to have a Guinness with you in a pub, and you were quite safe unless you were a Brit. Okay? Today it's become much more difficult. And even if you do access terrorists, there are limits to retrospective accounts. Terrorists are no different from you or I in that what leads them to a certain decision may be uncertain. They may not even know what leads them to a decision. But in retrospect, if you ask them, they will have justified what they're doing already. They would have thought about legitimizing what they're saying. It's like when you go buy a car. You're not sure what you want. You end up with a car. You drive home. And by the time you get home, you're loving it. And you're absolutely certain that you've made the best possible deal. You got the best price. And there's nothing better on the market. Why? Because you're self-justifying the decision that you already made. So this is a principle that functions when you interview terrorists as well. These are some of the systematic scientific approaches that have been undertaken to try to understand the issue of what motivates people to become terrorists. And we'll look briefly at each one of them. The psychological perspective basically argues that terrorists are mentally ill, that there is something specific, a terrorist psychologic that makes them different from you or I. Psychologists in this field use terms like narcissistic rage, which is the product of narcissistic injury, essentially ambition that remained unfulfilled, which frustrates a person, makes them angry. And some of the people with a narcissistic rage may find their way to terrorism as a way of channeling that anger against the world. The problem with the psychological inquiry into terrorism has been that it really failed to conclude anything specific. The conclusion has been that the outstanding common characteristic of terrorists is that they're normal from a psychiatric point of view. There is no specific idiosyncrasy that could be identified. Of course, psychologists also have had trouble getting terrorists on their couch. Now, of course, the people who argue that terrorists are in some way mentally ill will find many examples to support their case. And we could look at people like Andreas Baader, who had a brain lesion, leader of the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany, had a brain lesion and heavy history of drug use, which could have affected him. Or Shoko Asahara, who's a megalomaniac, the leader of the Japanese cult Aum Shinrikyo, which released sarin in the Tokyo subway in March 1995. Zarqawi I mentioned. Many leaders like Sinkyu from the Symbionese Liberation Army, Velupillai Prabhakaran from LTTE could also be described as mentally unstable at some level. Kozo Okamoto, who tried to circumcise himself with a spoon while in Israeli prison. Or Vladimir Khodov, the man who was capable of tormenting children in the Beslan school by piling chocolates in front of them. The kids aren't eating, they're not drinking for 3 days. And he would tempt them with his Kalashnikov, saying, try and touch it, see what happens. Or he would line up the children to go to the toilet, and they couldn't wait anymore. And he'd say, okay, sit down, wait for an hour. And an hour later, he'd do the same thing. It helps us understand that Khodov himself was quite a misfit during his school years. He was abused by his classmates. One time he was beaten up so badly in the toilet that he suffered permanent eye damage. And certainly reliving that fantasy of being in that school environment and being the bully and being in charge played a major role. But while we can certainly document the presence of psychopaths among terrorist organizations, there is no evidence that terrorist groups would have more psychopaths than any other population. The population of normal people might have 1% of psychopaths among them. Well, terrorist groups might have the same. We don't really know. Okay? Physiological approaches have not necessarily been applied to terrorism specifically, but have been quite useful in understanding the processes of aggression, basically looking at the secretion of hormones as a determinant of aggressive behavior. When we perceive an external threat that we see as existential, our perceptive cortex in our brain triggers a reaction which starts from the hypothalamus. It's associated with increased limbic activity, secretion of certain hormones. You have adrenaline that pours into your system. The body mobilizes nutrients, and through enlargement of blood vessels in the large muscles that we would use for fighting or running away, those nutrients are distributed to make us stronger for fighting or running away. It also results in the end in us sweating because we are, there's so much activity going on, so the system needs to cool down. And at the end of this scale is aggressive behavior. Some people who think that they couldn't hurt a fly are capable of doing some quite horrific things when they perceive themselves as being under existential threat. Now, if we could apply this to terrorism, and this is just a hypothesis, we could say that perhaps people who are from communities, language groups, ethnic groups, religious groups who perceive an existential threat against their own identity could be more aggressive as a result of this process. But again, this is simply a hypothesis and nothing more. And we could get into the distinction between effective and predatory aggression and the different brain cells that regulate each type of an aggression, but unfortunately we don't have time for that. But it is quite an interesting parallel when we look at aggressive behavior among animals and how they attack their own species versus attacking other species and so forth. And there has been quite a bit of interesting work done by militaries, specifically after World War I, World War II, when militaries found out that only 2% of their men are capable of killing. And some of these, only 2%, even when they're faced with the other army pointing guns at them, only 2% were capable of killing. 1% psychopaths, other percent extremely altruistic people who'd rather kill and die so their friends wouldn't be hurt. Very interesting research indeed. Socioeconomic political approaches argue that terrorists are not born, they are made by circumstances. And this is a popular root causes argument. And root causes actually refers to both sides of the political spectrum. When you have people on the left side of the political spectrum, they may emphasize things like political oppression or lack of development, poverty, the root causes of terrorism, with the idea that if we get rid of the root causes, then terrorism will go away. Even at the right side of the political spectrum, people who argue that the way to get rid of terrorism is increasing or strengthening democratic processes in the Middle East. That's really a root cause argument as well. Or people who argue that it's all in education, that terrorists are uneducated, and if they're more educated, if they know more about the Quran, for instance, when we refer to Islamists, then they couldn't engage in such violence. Some people quite, I think, elibistically like to use, sexual deprivation as the cause of terrorism, arguing that Islam as a religion doesn't provide enough opportunity for channeling of sexual energies, therefore it makes young men frustrated and willing to die for the 72 virgins that they meet in paradise. Okay? Quite simplistic interpretations. And again, you could cite examples. If you want examples, you can cite the 4 Palestinian suicide bombers who used aluminum foil from a chocolate to wrap their genitals to protect them for the afterlife. But again, we have to look at the representativeness of each one of those anecdotes. Again, we tend to use whatever fits what we already believe beforehand. And so we must resist that temptation to make that a universal observation. Just a comment I want to make on education. It's a common misconception that terrorists are uneducated people. In fact, they tend to be more educated than the average population out of which they come from. Perhaps there's quite a logical explanation. People who are poor and uneducated go to work, come home, go to work, come home, don't really have time for political debates and following the news and so forth. It's the people who are a little bit higher up who are engaged in these debates. And in fact, there seems to be a direct link between occupational choice or field of study and engagement in terrorism. Recent Oxford study has found out that, or commented that Al-Qaeda seems to have a greater representation of engineers than any other institution in the world, except maybe for engineering companies. And perhaps there's quite a logical explanation for this as well. People who come from exact science backgrounds see the world as a formula. 1 + 1 = 2, no other possible interpretation. And when you apply this type of thinking to social events, which of course have multiple causalities and multiple explanations, multiple points of view that could all be correct at the same time, this is something that escapes people from highly technical backgrounds. And if you apply a direct formula like this to an extreme view, that could really lead you to extreme action. One thing that's popular is the relative deprivation, frustration, aggression hypothesis, basically saying that deprivation leads to frustration, which then leads to aggression. Makes sense. However, the problem with this approach is exactly what Rory mentioned in the introduction. How do we account for the absolute majority of people who live in these conditions who do not become terrorists? Because only a small percentage of any population will become terrorists. So how do we account for everybody else who lives under those conditions who does not choose terrorism? Similarly, how do we account for countries where terrorism occurs quite prominently, and the difference between that country and another country which seems to have very similar socio-economic indicators, same levels of corruption, same levels of development, same levels of education, and everything else, and there terrorism does not occur. So again, there's a very chronic problem of specificity when we look at these root cause arguments. So there's got to be something more. This is a graph that I think is perhaps less helpful than it initially appears, basically describing the relative deprivation hypothesis, that there's a perception of a certain deprivation coupled with comparison, where you look around you and the situation doesn't seem to be fair. There seems to be some kind of a pattern in your view that makes you feel like you're discriminated against based on some criteria, such as your religion, ethnicity, language, background, so forth. Then there's the attribution of blame. Somebody's guilty for this type of a situation and for this lack of fairness, which then can lead to stereotyping, demonization, and dehumanization of the enemy. Now, perhaps this is a process that does occur. At the same time, it's not specific enough. Most of us go through this every day with respect to our bosses and spouses and so forth, and we don't necessarily become terrorists. Organizational approaches basically argue that terrorism is a group phenomenon. Terrorism is not an individual phenomenon. So we have to understand group dynamics and the psychology of group decision-making to account for the extremity of terrorist actions. We have to understand that for people who have radical political views, it's very difficult to belong somewhere. It's difficult to have political debates with friends, with classmates, or with your family. People will tell you that you're crazy. They won't agree with you because your views are extreme, which strengthens your resentment. You withdraw. We don't like conflict. And it's very hard for people who are highly radical politically to encounter others who share their same views. So once that happens, once they actually do encounter people who share their views, there's a process of drawing in. We tend to be drawn by people who can listen to us and who can appreciate our perspectives. There's also value reinforcement. Not only do these people agree with us, but they also provide more evidence for the fact that we're right. More anecdotes to support what we are saying. And specifically, extreme groups tend to isolate themselves from the mainstream, tend to demonize the mainstream as ignorant, and so forth. Also, for clandestine organizations, and the presence of extreme danger tends to reinforce relationships. It's not dissimilar from armies, for instance. People who went and actually fought on the battlefield, many veterans have a hard time fitting into the society when they come home. And the friendships don't seem to be real because they're very shallow. They're not based on this, the extreme camaraderie that is developed when you operate in the face of extreme danger and have to depend on somebody else for your own life. Dependency is a very, very strong bonding mechanism. Groupthink. Basically, this is a psychological process which would deserve an hour and a half maybe to explain. But this is a psychological process that helps us explain why we as a terrorist group might arrive at a more extreme conclusion than the sum of every single one of our own views and perspectives. We could have a group that collectively decides something, and individually, nobody would agree with that decision, and yet they support it. And there are all sorts of factors such as presence of central authority. There are perceptions of invulnerability, which lead to excessive risk-taking. There's a perception of super morality. That's really what we need to understand about terrorists as well. These are people who sacrifice their future lives, their careers, maybe even their lives as they know it, if they're suicide bombers, for others. They view the people who are the enemy, of course, as the enemy, but their own constituents who disagree with them, they view them with respect. Because these people, they just want to have their own life. They don't do anything to change the situation, which is unacceptable. We are actually here doing something. We're actually risking our lives. We're taking our own innocence on the altar by killing, while these people do nothing. Therefore, we feel as more super moral, and therefore we're quite difficult to persuade by constituencies that our actions are too extreme and they're not helpful. In terms of brainwashing, all I want to comment on brainwashing is that this is quite overrated, and specifically when we talk about Al-Qaeda and the young men who went to train in Afghanistan. They weren't brainwashed. Brainwashing wasn't part of the training process. All these people were committed when they came. Getting to Afghanistan, especially at that time, was no easy feat. It's very dangerous. You don't go unless you know what you're doing. But one thing that did tend to happen was that certain recruits would be redirected. Almost every Westerner who came to Al-Qaeda camps came there with the image of dying, fighting the Russian army in Bosnia, typically. In Chechnya. Alternatively, Bosnia was a popular destination. Kashmir was a popular destination. And sometimes Al-Qaeda was able to influence these specific people into going back home and organizing operations at home because of a specific skill set that these people had, such as a clean Western passport, knowledge of the culture, knowledge of the language, and so forth. But it wasn't brainwashing per se, turning somebody completely innocent into radical extremists. Okay.